Good morning, everybody. I am very happy to know that the Congressman Raul Cruz is here with us from California. We would like to welcome him to the podium to introduce our guest speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a very important session, and I'm very proud to be here with all of you. I'm Congressman Dr. Raul Ruiz. I represent California's 25th Congressional District. I have a background in human rights, humanitarian, and disaster aid from Harvard School of Public Health, and so this issue is very important to me. I want to welcome all of you to the United States Congress, those that don't work here, and I also want to extend a special thank you to Professor Javid Rehman, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, for joining us today. As you know, the regime in Iran is one of the most prolific violators of human rights in the world. According to Amnesty International, Iran carried out 74% of all global executions in 2023. This is an astonishingly large number for a country that accounts for only 1% of the global population. One of the biggest and most documented crimes committed by the clerical tyrants in Iran occurred in the summer of 1988, during which 30,000 political prisoners were executed. And I had the honor of speaking with some that survived as political prisoners during that time, just recently speaking with them, and their stories are so compelling, and it's a miracle of their strength to keep their humanity despite such tortures. In 2017, I was part of a group of 78 bipartisan members of Congress that co-sponsored House Resolution 188 that called attention to this dark chapter in human history. One of the most important demands of House Resolution 188 was to urge the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran and the United Nations Human Rights Council to create a commission of inquiry to fully investigate the massacre by gathering evidence and identifying the names and roles of specific perpetrators with a view towards bringing them to justice. So 7 years later, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Rehman to talk about his findings on this very topic. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rehman. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I am very grateful to you for this kind introduction, and I'm grateful to my good friend Beth here and other people who have been very generous in their invitation. And this is a really important day today because the subject is very critical. And I say this because for so long we have not been able to fully investigate and look into the crimes that were committed by the Iranian regime once it took over in 1979, you see. So this is the first report, a comprehensive report that I have produced. And what I've done in this report is that I'm looking primarily from the time of the Iranian Revolution of 1979 to 1988. So I'm looking at 10 years. And within those 10 years, I'm looking at what I say atrocity crimes, focusing in 1981, 82, and obviously 1988, when thousands of political prisoners were executed while in prison. So I'm sure we will have a lot of questions, and I'll be very happy to explain to you those issues. But I have focused in this report, as I say, upon atrocity crimes. And when I say atrocity crimes, many of you might be familiar with the meaning of atrocity crimes. But just to give you an indication, the atrocity crimes that I have investigated, they are primarily crimes against humanity and genocide. And when I'm talking about atrocity crimes, I have been detailing the summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions of thousands of arbitrarily imprisoned political opponents, which I say amount to the crimes against humanity of murder and extermination. And these crimes focus on what happened to political opponents in 1981, 82, and then in 1988, but because that was the time when most of these political opponents or prisoners were executed. In my report, there is also a detailed consideration of the crimes against humanity of torture, persecution, and enforced disappearances, and other inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering, serious injuries to the bodies and to the mental and physical health of the political prisoners. So you see, when we talk about crimes against humanity, that is a whole umbrella of crimes in international law. So it isn't simply murder and extermination, whereby thousands of political opponents face that consequence, but they also suffered from torture. There was also persecution, and importantly, there was the enforced disappearances. And I'm sure you're familiar with the meaning of enforced disappearances, but just to elaborate, give you the context, that there are still thousands of individuals, thousands of families whose loved ones or whose relatives are enforcibly disappeared because they don't know what happened to them. So, for example, in 1988, people were executed, and then tragically, as we understand, that their bodies were dumped in mass graves. And their families were not told what has happened. So they're still searching for a closure. See? So enforced disappearance, and I'm frequently asked this question, enforced disappearance is a crime which is continuing to this day. It will continue to the day when the survivors or their families come to know what happened to the individual who had been forcibly disappeared. So that is very important for us to remember, that it is not merely historic. This crime of enforced disappearance is a crime of continuity. It's a crime happening today. And tragically, the executions that took place in the 1980s, included those of women. Some of them reportedly were raped before their executions. And these executions also included a very large number of children. Because insofar as the Iranian regime was concerned, it wasn't the age or it wasn't any factors of humanity that they took into account. It was simply any person they found who had an independent position was simply to be eradicated. So there were hundreds of children that were executed in the 1980s. Yeah. So in my specific examination of crimes against humanity, I have also analyzed the sexual and gender-based crimes against women and girls. And as I say, the concern about rape before execution is a very serious one, because what the regime was doing, they had their own archaic interpretation of Sharia law, whereby they could not execute women who were not married or who were virgins. So they forcibly raped these political prisoners. And then they were executed, and then they were going round to the families of these girls saying that your daughter got married before she was executed. You see, that was the level that the regime violated human dignity. I've also looked at the issue of violations of the rights of religious, ethnic, and linguistic minorities during the first decade of the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, obviously, there was clear persecution of religious minorities like the Baha'is. But what I found out, and I mean, I am probably in a minority view, but I strongly believe that there was a genocidal intent in the elimination of the Baha'is in the early years after 1979. And now, you may not agree with me, but from what I have, investigated, I think that the idea was to eliminate the Baha'is. There were over 200 Baha'is who were executed, but thousands were tortured. Thousands were put under mental pressure, mental and physical torture. They were forced to renounce their faith. And that was the only avenue for their survival. So I believe that, we should be honest and open about what we think happened in the early years of the revolution. And that's why I believe that there was certainly a genocidal intent in the treatment of the regime of the Baha'is, but also other ethnic and religious and linguistic groups, such as the Kurdish people, They also suffered in the immediate aftermath of 1979 revolution. So in my report, I have noted that the atrocity crimes represent the commission of the worst and the most egregious human rights abuses of our living memory, whereby high-ranking state officials connived, conspired, and actively engaged to plan, order, and commit crimes against humanity and genocide against the nationals of their own state. Now, this is quite surprising, but also quite shocking, that the atrocities that were committed in the 1980s, in particular the 1988 massacre, remains as one of the most egregious violations of human rights in our living memory. And yet, we've had no investigations into what happened. And often, that is something which is very disturbing. Why has the world not come round to actually look into this most serious violation of modern times? And as I say, that notwithstanding the availability of overwhelming evidence, to this day, those with criminal responsibility for these grave and most serious violations of human rights and crimes under international law remain in power and in control. The international community has been unable or unwilling to hold these individuals accountable. Indeed, many of the individuals implicated in these atrocity crimes continue to enjoy the official governmental privileges and impunity from international justice and accountability. So if you look at the leading figures in the Iranian regime right now, you would find many of these individuals holding on to power. So the obvious case would be of the former President Ibrahim Raisi, but the current supreme leader, Khamenei, is one of those who was heavily implicated in the execution, in the mass executions of these political prisoners. You had one presidential candidate, Mr. Pur Mohammadi, who by his own acceptance was a member of the Death Commission. There are many others who are part of the regime who actively instigated, planned, and perpetuated these crimes against humanity and genocide. And yet the world is silent. And to my mind, that was a great tragedy and great sadness that after Ibrahim Raisi's death, he was somehow kind of respected as someone who was the president, honorable president of Iran. And his past actions were never brought to the forum in the international community. And world leaders were willing to give him a lot of respect for what he had done to the people of Iran, you see. And by the respect, I tell you that he was at the forefront of these orderings of these executions. So there needs to be some kind of accountability, some kind of justice to be done for the people who have been suffering for a very long time. And that is what my report recommends. Survivors and witnesses of the mass atrocities, in particular the atrocity in 1988, they remain in immeasurable grief, and an undeniable victimhood presents a living testimony to these atrocities. As survivors mentioned in their testimony in my report, and I interviewed at least 80 persons, they mention in their testimonies that they are all faced with mental and psychological trauma on a perpetual basis as they search for a dignified, respectful, and humane closure to their daily suffering and pain. In innumerable cases, families of those forcibly disappeared continue to search for their loved ones as the authorities persist in violating their rights. These victims and survivors look towards the United Nations and members of the international community, which also includes the United States government, for truth, justice, and accountability. Through the prism of the first decade after the revolution of 1979 in Iran, I have looked into the contemporary situation, and it's quite interesting that the current day egregious violations of human rights and crimes under international law are somehow connected to what happened in 1979 and in the 1980s. You see, and I will explain to you that when we talk about 1979 and 1980s, these crimes are not historical. These crimes are happening today. And our honorable congressman just mentioned the high volume of the executions that have been taking place in Iran, and he rightly mentioned that over 800 persons were executed last year. But the connection goes back to 1979, you see, because a lot of these executions also come from the time when, for example, the Islamic revolutionary courts were set up. They were developed to dispense revolutionary justice. And most of these executions that are happening today are through the Islamic revolutionary courts of 1979 and afterwards. So the connection is pretty obvious. There are other very important connections. If you look at the Women Life Freedom Movement, you see, which started in September 2022 after the killing of Gina Mahsa Amini. The raison d'être of that movement was the resistance from girls and women of Iran, because they could not accept a policy of enforced hijab. But when did this policy originate? This policy originated with Khomeini's idea in the early 1980s that women have a role in an Islamic society and they must be subdued through a policy of enforced hijab. So the connection is pretty obvious. Do you see my point? And also, you see, the continued application of the various arbitrary discriminatory provisions of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the Constitution of 1979, along with the currently applied arbitrary and overbroad national security offenses such as muharabe, by which we mean waging war against God, and afsad fil ard, spreading corruption on earth, which the Iranian authorities continue to use to execute protesters and other dissidents, are also from that time. See, the connection I'm trying to highlight. The perpetual executions of those arrested as children. See, we hear every year that a number of children are executed in Iran. And the connection again goes back to the then Supreme Leader, because he started the process of execution of children. The children are being executed on a yearly basis, the perpetual execution, as well as the institutional structure through which human rights violations are weaponized and instrumentalized, including, what I just said, through the use of Islamic revolutionary courts, were conceptualized, devised, and implemented during the period of this investigation of my report of 10 years. Now, that was just a brief overview, but what I want to do is to conclude with some of my recommendations. What would I like the international community to do? You see, I have concluded in my report making a number of recommendations to the international community and to the Human Rights Council and to the individual members to take, what I say, concrete steps to end the continuing impunity within the Islamic Republic of Iran, ensuring accountability, truth, and justice, as well as reparations. I call upon the international community to establish an international investigative and accountability mechanism to conduct prompt, impartial, thorough, and transparent investigations into the crimes under international law, as I have mentioned in my report. And this means crimes against humanity, but also the crime of genocide. So there must be an independent investigative mechanism. Thank you. So there must be an independent investigative accountability mechanism which would conduct prompt, impartial, thorough, and transparent investigations into the crimes under international law, and to gather, consolidate, and preserve evidence with a view towards future criminal prosecution of all perpetrators of criminal offenses. More specifically, the proposed international accountability mechanism must investigate the atrocity crimes committed during 1981, 82, and in 1988 against thousands of political opponents of the authorities, in particular their mass, summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions amounting to the crimes against humanity of murder and extermination, and the continuing concealment of the fate of thousands of political opponents, and the whereabouts of all their remains, which amounts to the crime against humanity of enforced disappearances. As I've just explained to you before, enforced disappearance is a continuing crime under international law, as long as the perpetrators continue to conceal the fate of the disappeared persons and the facts remain unclarified. Yeah. And in my investigations, what I found was the Iranian regime is now hiding the evidence, you see. All of these mass graves are being damaged or destroyed, you see. They're concealing what happened in 1988, where these bodies were dumped. And therefore, if we do not take prompt action, we may, in the future, have seen all of the evidence being destroyed by the Iranian regime. You see, they are very active in destroying all forms of evidence of what happened to these thousands of political prisoners who were extrajudicially and summarily and arbitrarily executed. Yeah. Additionally, I have proposed that this mechanism must investigate the crimes against humanity of torture, persecution, and other inhumane acts causing great suffering and serious injuries to the individuals because they suffered a lot of physical injuries, mental injuries. They were tortured while in prison. And then they were summarily executed. There were no trials. There was no fairness in how these individuals were addressed. I mean, the story is very painful of the 1988 massacre. because a lot of these young men were there for several years. You know, they were there. Either they have finished their prison sentences, or they had not repented, or they had their political views which did not align. So they had not committed any criminal offenses. They were just there. And in fact, many of them were told that there will be commissions which would come and give them pardons. So many of these individuals who tragically ended up being executed, they were given the impression that there will be commissions set up who will come and pardon them. And to the contrary, these commissions, at the behest and at the fatwa of Khomeini, they were ordered, and Khomeini's fatwa is now public. At that time, it was not public in 1988. I mean, Muntazari made that fatwa public. But that fatwa clearly was vengeful. That fatwa was based on an idea that anyone, he targeted what he called as the munafiqeen, anyone who did not adhere to the policies of Khomeini and his regime must be executed. You see, these people, those prisoners, were not to be tried in a court of law. They were not to be tried for any criminal offenses, but simply because of their political views, they were to be executed. Yeah? And the Death Commission did not ask them any legal questions. The Death Commission simply asked them, for example, that are you supporters of PMOI? And if they said yes, there you go. You get executed, you see. Or in the second phase, they were asking people, are you a communist? Are you a kafir? And if somebody said, yes, I am, there you go, you get executed. So simply for political opinions, thousands of people were executed. And yet, as I say, it remains one of those tragic, unfortunate stories of our lifetimes which has never been investigated, and there has never been any kind of mechanisms to hold individuals accountable. So my main recommendation, as I've just been saying, is the establishment of an investigative mechanism, an accountability mechanism. The accountability mechanism that I want to be set up must also conduct prompt and transparent investigations into the pattern of sexual and gender-based violence that was perpetuated by the authorities against women and girls, including cases of reported crime, of rape before executions. You see, when I was completing my investigations, I came across so many women who had been sexually, physically abused in prison. And their case has not been looked into, you see. And any mechanism that is established must also investigate the case of sexual and gender-based violence that was committed by these individuals. And also, as I say, the investigative mechanism must also look at the case of ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities who were also targeted, persecuted, and, in my view, subjected to genocide in the first decade of 1979 onwards. In addition to establishing the international accountability mechanism, I also call upon the international community and particularly the United States government to require the Iranian authorities to, inter alia, establish fully the truth regarding the mass enforced disappearances. So, as I say, thousands of people were forcibly disappeared. There must also be some kind of investigations as to the reasoning why thousands of people were extrajudicially, arbitrarily, and summarily executed. and they were subjected to the crime of genocide. And I want justice for the victims. I want justice for the survivors. I want justice for those families who have been campaigning for the past 45 years for some kind of closure. We want reparations. We want the Iranian regime to be held accountable before an international court of law. Now, the big challenge that we face is, and this is very important for us, that given the serious structural obstacles making the judicial system of the Islamic Republic of Iran unable, unwilling, and unavailable to investigate crimes under international law or other human rights violations committed by state agents, I also urge individual states to exercise universal and other extraterritorial jurisdiction in relation to crimes under international law, so that there are criminal investigations identifying those suspected of responsibility, including the commanders and other superiors, and issuing, when there is sufficient admissible evidence, international arrest warrants. So if a perpetrator of a crime that was committed in Iran in the first decade since 1979, if they are apprehended, let's say in the United States, they must be arrested and tried for the crimes they have committed, the crimes in international law. See, they must not be able to escape justice simply because they have escaped the country Iran, and they are somehow trying to live in another state whereby they think that they can avoid justice. So it's very important that we use universal jurisdiction, and I know that the United States can and has set precedents in the past where people who have committed crimes elsewhere have been tried in the US courts, and they have been held accountable for their crimes committed outside of the United States. Yeah, on this point, I was disappointed at the recent swapping of Hamid Nouri. You may know of his case, Mr. Hamid Nouri. Mr. Hamid Nouri was convicted by Swedish courts, starting from the district court all the way up to the highest possibility. There was a fair trial that he received, and he was convicted for the crimes that he had committed in the 1988 massacre. And yet the Swedish government decided to swap him, ignoring the pleas of thousands of victims, for what I say hostage diplomacy, because they swapped him for two individuals, you see. And I think that sets a very bad precedent, in my view, that when somebody is tried for crimes against international law, they must face justice. And that's what Hamid Nouri should have done. I can perhaps end here, and we can take some questions, if that's all right. Yeah? Okay.
There's no real solution to this. My question is, how do we take over the United Nations so we actually have some type of human rights? Because we're going to have to take over the UN so that way we can actually enforce international law and have a functional world court. Otherwise, there is no human rights across the entire world. I'm game. I don't know how we do it, right?
Yeah.
Kimberly Love.
It's an important question. It challenges us in so many ways. But I think what is important is, let's focus on key issues, right? So when we're looking at the extrajudicial, summary, arbitrary executions of thousands of people who never received any kind of fair trial, it's important that the international community considers that this is such a serious crime in international law, that there must be an investigation into that, you see. So if and I hope you have some influence with the US government, you press upon them that, look, this has happened. And there is evidence to that effect. You know, there are witnesses, there are people who are survivors of the 1988 massacre. They should have some justice, and there should be an accountability mechanism. I think we have to start from a smaller position. You know, we won't be able to remedy all of the, all of the violations in the world that are taking place. But at least where there are most serious, most egregious violations that have happened, I think leaders from the free world must take responsibility to ensure that there is justice and ultimately some kind of, international rule of law and respect for human dignity. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. You can also introduce yourself as well. Yeah.
I'm Anila Ali. I'm with the American Muslim Multi-Faith Women's
Yeah,
Empowerment
yeah.
Council. And of course, as women and a women's rights organization,
Yeah.
we are very concerned about the silence that we hear about violence against women, especially in conflict areas.
Yeah.
And of course, Iran, it's a prime example of how the Muslim world forgot Mahsa Amini and the girls. And this is not now. If you remember 2000, early 2000, there was Nida. So this has been going on and on. Why do you think there is that reluctance to call Iran out in the Muslim world?
Yeah, that's a great question. But we have to be honest with ourselves. There is a lot of hypocrisy in the Muslim world itself. We also engage with double standards, you know. So I come from Pakistan. And the problem is that, we speak a lot about Islamophobia. I'm sure you would have come across this term that, we speak a lot about minority rights, Muslim minorities being undermined, let's say, in the US or in Canada or in Europe. But we never look at how we treat our own minorities. You see what I mean? I don't want to digress too much, but there are groups in countries like Pakistan, like the Ahmadis, for example, or in Bangladesh, or in Malaysia, or in other countries, where we have double standards. We repress them. We don't practice the principles of equality, rule of law, and non-discrimination. Do you see what I mean? I come from a country where we have death penalty for blasphemy. You see? So we have to engage. We have to have an objective values of human rights. No one should be executed simply for their right to freedom of expression. But unfortunately, this is what's happening in many parts of the world. And let's not forget, there are many countries in the Middle East who consistently violate human rights, also in the name of religion. So, yeah, we have, yeah.
My name is Rajiullah Yegani. I live in North Carolina, and I'm an ordinary citizen, not affiliated with any group or organization. My question is for those people like Raisi, who was the president of the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran, and his plane crashed a couple of weeks ago, and he passed away. Like Raisi and other people whose hands are in the blood of people, he was part of the death committee in 1988, massacred 30,000 people in Iran. Should they be able to freely come to the United Nations, in the United States, in the land of freedom, and go back with their entourage at the same time, deliver lecture in the United Nations? Should they be free to do that?
Well, the simple answer is no. When individuals have committed grave crimes in international law, that is what I'm saying, that where there is substantial evidence that these grave crimes, these very serious crimes in international law have been committed, and the 1988 massacre stands out as one of the gravest incident of these crimes, these people should not be allowed. And we should not allow people like Raisi, we should not have allowed him to freely roam about. He should be in some kind of an international criminal court facing prosecution, you see. But international diplomacy and international politics, unfortunately, comes in the way. I mean, you just have to be frank that, you know, the free world would be very willing even to come to some kind of compromise with the Iranian regime, knowing fully well what they have done, if their political interests were aligned. So I think that the message that I'm wanting to pass to you is that we have to make a decision that our human rights standards must take priority over our political considerations. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, thank you. Hi.
How do you feel about Iran being on the peace council for India or even being represented in the UN? Do you think it's helpful for the people of Iran to have the Iranian regime? Yeah, okay. How do you feel about Iran being on the peace council in the UN or even being represented in the UN when other countries aren't?
Yeah. So you see, the big challenge is that Iran Iranian regime is one of the brutal regimes, as we've been discussing, that over 800 people were executed last year. Thousands are persecuted because of their political opinions. No semblance of democracy. But the way the international community operates, it's not that we respect democracy and rule of law. There are many other repressive regimes, for example, in the Middle East or in Africa, who are also represented in the United Nations. And they support the Iranians, you know. They don't mind these violations. They think that, okay, Iran is violating the rights, but they're violating the rights of their own people. So long as we can do business with Iran, that's fine. I mean, I can say here about my own country, we neighbor Iran, and we openly say that we are going to do business with the Iranians. We don't have any inhibitions, you see. And the ironic thing is that the United States and the European Union is heavily supporting countries like Pakistan. And when they're supporting countries like Pakistan, they're giving them aid, knowing fully well that they're also allies of Iran. So there is a lot of political maneuvering going on. Do you see what I mean? It's not straightforward. Yeah. Well, you know, in an ideal world, we should only allow the democratic vision of individuals. You know, it should be only democracies. You know, the will of the people should be represented at the international level. But in reality, it doesn't happen. I mean, we're talking about one country, Iran, but as I say, there are many other undemocratic countries, many other brutal regimes, where we're quite happy to do business with them, so long as we get our own diplomatic interests organized. Human rights is not our priority, and that must shift, not just in the case of Iran, but also with other regimes. Sorry? Well, we believe in democracy. You know, you're living in the free world, right? Well, we would tend to think that the U.S. represents democracy, right? U.S. has a lot of influence, you know. That is for sure. It has influence. But what I'm saying is that we should not compromise our human rights values. What we want, let's say, for the people of the United States, you know, freedom of expression, equality, non-discrimination, men and women being equal. Can you imagine a country like Iran where having a different sexual orientation means death? How can you do business with a country like Iran, right? Or, you know, just having changing your faith could mean death, you know? So I think there should be certain standards, right? But then again, it isn't just Iran. What about Saudi Arabia, What about Qatar? What about all of these Gulf states, you know? So targeting one country vis-a-vis another simply because your political interests are, are not working, sparing a country like Saudi Arabia, for example. Why would we do that when they have very similar oppressive, laws and policies? I think the West and the free world must consider those human rights policies. They must be at the forefront of any engagement.
My name is Beth Akiyama, and I'm with Youth for Human Rights. And one of the things you keep mentioning that I think is so appropriate is that you have to have human rights standards. And what our organization does is that we actually promote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we find that it's really not known around the world. I myself didn't know until someone said, you should promote this. It sounds great. What is it? And if everyone knew the 30 rights, the human rights, we say human rights a lot, but there is an initial standard at least, a basic standard.
That's right, yeah.
That is a foundational document of the United Nations. And Mr. Turk, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, has done a lot. Our last 75th anniversary, in December, there was a lot to promote that. And I would just encourage we do a lot more, because there are 8 billion people on the planet. It's a lot to reach. But even maybe the countries that are more amenable to holding those standards in the Muslim world could set the example and be the beginning of it. And then a democracy is one of the human rights. And also, I just thought that you mentioned that the United States could take action. And it seems to me like where it would be presented to the United States that there were actions in Iran that were against the United States, that they would be more willing to do something about that than maybe just a situation that is only happening in Iran.
Yeah. So on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you should all. I hope everybody is familiar. I hope that everybody is familiar, certainly in the United States, because this was one document which President Roosevelt and other American leaders promoted and actually were at the forefront of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it was very important for the United States to set up what we call it as the Magna Carta of Human Rights. The Declaration is a primary document. But what has happened since then is that the United States is not really fully aligning itself with all of the international human rights instruments and standards, including, as I was discussing with my good friend this morning, including the non-ratification of the Women's Rights Convention, the Child Rights Convention, many other international treaties and documents. So, for example, the U.S. is not a party to the International Criminal Court as yet, you see. So if you are the standard bearers of human rights and you want to promote and project human rights, you should be taking the lead in accepting those standards yourself, you see. I think it's very important for the U.S. to accept these international standards because they set the global benchmark. They're not for any one particular society, community, or tradition. These are global standards. The United States cannot criticize a country like Iran for not ratifying CEDAW when it itself has not done that. Do you see what I mean? So it's very important that the global standards are accepted by all of these countries.
Thank you for being here. You mentioned political executions in Iran. And you also mentioned a number of executions this past year, over 800 people. Part of your reports, as I was listening, was the 1988 massacre. That's 30,000 people, and the span is not a year, but rather 3 months. Can you expand on who were these people? What was their political affiliations, and why were they executed?
Yeah. So you see, the first thing is that I'm not clear as to how many people were executed, you see. The numbers differ. But one thing is certain, that thousands were executed, you see. It's not clear, the precise number. The second point is that these political prisoners, a vast majority, were actually detained from earlier years, so 1981, 82, for small acts of dissidence, small acts of opposition. For example, distributing pamphlets, or showing dissent, And what happened was that the Iran-Iraq war, which started in 1980, it gave the Khomeini regime a carte blanche to actually incarcerate anyone they thought was an opponent. So thousands were just incarcerated. They were there without ever having any proper trial, you see. So I came across many witnesses who were just arrested and put in prison for having done nothing wrong. They were either executed in the earlier years or just kept in prison till 1988. And some, as I've said, were going to finish their prison sentences or had finished their prison sentences, but they had been kept in prison because the regime did not trust them. But they were not engaged in any violent criminal activities. They were just political, dissidents. And there were many others who were leftists and Marxists and had their own independent kind of political mindset. They were also there. So the regime did not accept any kind of independence or free thinking, and therefore the best solution for them was they wanted to get rid of individuals, and in their weird mind, the best way to get rid of that number of people was to execute them. You see, it was extremely tragic, and that's what happened. And the worst tragedy of all that is, despite all of these executions, all of the mass atrocities that were committed, the world has kept silent. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rehman, for such a great session, very informative, very inspirational, and at the same time, it makes all of us accountable to use this valuable document to take the next step to make the Iranian regime, accountable globally. And at this point, we will resume our question and answer, if you don't mind. But we have the representative from Sheila Jackson-Lee's office here with a special message for our session. I would like to invite her to read the Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee's message for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Lily Coney. I'm Chief of Staff for Congresswoman Jackson-Lee. I have a message from her I'd like to convey to you. Unfortunately, she's not able to join you today. Congresswoman Jackson-Lee asks that I extend her thanks to all of you for attending today's important discussion. Congresswoman Jackson-Lee proudly represents the 18th Congressional District of Texas for nearly 3 decades. She works with her bipartisan colleagues in the Congressional Iranian Women's Caucus and Iranian Human Rights and Democracy Caucus to highlight the violations of human rights, and particularly that of women, the plight of women in Iran. She champions not only their rights, but also their ongoing struggle for freedom and human dignity, because theirs is a global struggle. Many peoples around the world seek the life that we have in the United States and many democracies around the world. The people of Iran, indeed the global community's interests, demand an end to arbitrary arrests, executions, pervasive injustices, and high-profile massacres that have occurred over more than 4 decades. Congresswoman Jackson-Lee asks that I extend her welcome to Mr. Javid Rehman, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, who is now on Capitol Hill, to bring us that message. Mr. Javid Rehman is the 3rd United Nations Special Rapporteur to serve in this capacity. As a student of Islamic law, he is well positioned to understand the grave conditions that exist within Iran. Because Congresswoman Jackson Lee shares these concerns regarding Iran's treatment of women and girls, she introduced H-Res 310, a resolution condemning the inaction of the Islamic Republic of Iran and addressing the poisoning of Iranian schoolgirls. This resolution recognizes the bravery and resilience of women who have faced tremendous challenges in their fight for equality and human rights. As a longtime advocate and fighter for religious expression, justice, and equality, Congresswoman Jackson Lee has been and continues to be inspired by the ongoing Iranian women who continues their struggle despite the tortures their families face daily. She thanks you and she thanks them for keeping the light of freedom alive. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for being with us in such an early hour today. I hope the coffee service helped you to stay awake. And I would like to have a special thank. There's a question? Okay. Go ahead, please. There is another question. We resume our question and answer session, then we continue. Thank you, Mr.
Hi. Hello. Yeah, I have two questions on behalf of my congressional office. What are your thoughts on the president-elect of Iran? And the other question is, did the president-elect have any involvement in the massacres of 1981 and 1988?
Well, from what we hear, is that he's a reformist individual who prior to his being elected, made many statements in terms of, for example, having a more humanitarian view towards the rights of women and girls and more equitable society. But the difficulty we have is that the violations that take place in Iran are systemic. You see, it's not individuals. You know, if we said it's a democratic country, so the president could come and make some changes. But I really doubt that this is going to happen. What is going to happen, he will be put in a place where he would have to follow the system. And the system is itself inherently discriminatory, and it violates human rights. So I'm not very optimistic that there would be substantial, significant change insofar as the human rights situation is concerned. But I could be proven wrong. I mean, I have not been proven wrong for many years, but I would love to be proven wrong. Thank you. Yeah, please.
I had a couple of questions for you. First, I wanted to ask, is your report available for viewing to get the data and facts from the report? And secondly, do you have any concerns for your safety for bringing up all of these atrocities into light?
Yeah, so the report itself, I'm told, will be uploaded on the 17th of July, so it will be next week. It's been completed and submitted, and there are some procedural elements that we have to share with the permanent mission in Geneva, so we're doing that. So it should be uploaded next week, Wednesday, 17th. And personal safety, yeah, I mean, you know that Iranian regime, they are not really concerned about individuals. So if you are vocally against them, you're always questioning, you're always questioning your own integrity, and you're always putting yourself at risk in that sense. So there is a risk of reprisals. So you have to be, you have to take that kind of risk with yourself. And the only hope that we have is because we have a UN mandate that there is some kind of international protocol that they would not personally attack you. But there's no guarantee that this would not happen. Yeah.
Thank you. What is the procedure? Are you going to send the report to the Iranian government to review it, or what?
Yeah, so the procedure is that we have sent it to the Iranian government. And the idea is that they will make comments and their own contribution. But I'm not sure whether they will do that, because the report is quite strongly critical. So I don't know how they will react and how they'll react within the United Nations, mechanisms. Mm-hmm.
I have a question myself here. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your report and information that you have provided to the international community. As you said, it's one of the tragedies that in the 80s the world watched. We all have, a lot of Iranians have firsthand experience of that. I can speak about many individuals that I knew myself. But could you a little bit talk about or elaborate on who were really the people and their any kind of organizations, any kind of a group? They were a lot of students, there were a lot of children, there were pregnant women. But what was really their crime that you have found through your investigation, and their affiliation? What is it? What was their crime, and who were they really? So if you could just a little bit elaborate on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. So you see, one of the interesting things that I discovered when I was doing this report was that there was an interlinkage to what happened in 1979 and in 1980, 81, 82, the mass killings of individuals, to the 1988 massacre. And that had not been explored fully previously. So a lot of people who were put in prison, incarcerated, or subjected to mass executions in 1981, 82, were actually belonging to the same political affiliation. So many of them were the members of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, or the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. And it all started because the Mujahideen-e-Khalq was the primary opposition. It became the primary opposition to Khomeini. You would know that there was a bomb blast in 1980, June 1980. Yeah? And the Khomeini regime used that bomb blast, in which 73 people were killed. They used that to then, what has been described by one leading authority as the unleashing of the reign of terror. They literally killed thousands on the streets, And at that time, the way they executed people was through shooting. They were killing people on the streets. Yeah. So people who remember Iran in early 1980s, many of them testified to myself. They said that every night they would hear these shots, gunshots. It's embedded in their mindset that young people, children were being shot. And then every day in the newspapers, there was dozens of names that were published that, 70 people have been executed, 40, 100. And this is atrocious. This is unacceptable. And yet the world kept silent. The world kept silent. And this must be because of the geopolitics. It must be. I mean, Iran-Iraq war would be one influence. But the political interests of the global powers just kept them not interfering insofar as the human rights issues were concerned. So, tragic as it is, grossly tragic, but even more tragic is that these thousands of people were killed. They were killed without having committed any crime. And for me, it was quite a big challenge when I was completing this report, because I was told that my mandate just limits myself to current atrocities that are being committed. Because if you look at my resolution, it talks about current human rights situation. So that was quite a big challenge as to how I defend my case of going back to the crimes in 1980s. But when I started speaking to people, to the victims, their stories are so tragic. I met, for example, women who lost their husbands just simply because they were politically active. They were just brought in and shot dead. They don't know what happened to their husbands. There are mothers looking for their children. There are, parents looking for their children. There are people looking for their siblings. They don't know what happened. And I just feel so shocked that the world is not doing anything about it. And I think it's our moral and legal responsibility. Now you have my report. Each one of you is responsible. If you don't do anything, then don't come and blame me for not having done enough. So the free world. So the free world must take it upon itself to do justice to the people of Iran. I'm not saying that, the whole world or the whole region must be turned around and there must be a democratic Iran. I am saying that there must be accountability and justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rehman. You are absolutely right. You have created this valuable document, and it is our job to use that document to make Iranian regime accountable for, as you mentioned well, crime against humanity that happened in Iran. We really, really appreciate your effort. I know I have been involved a little bit, and I know how difficult and challenging it has been for you to prepare this report and to submit it to the United Nations Human Rights Council, and with all the rules and restrictions within the UN system. We really appreciate your effort. I am sure your name will remain in Iran's history forever. And all the families, and as you mentioned, wives, mothers, fathers who have lost their loved ones during that massacre, they really appreciate your effort. As I mentioned in our panel at the Human Rights Council on June 19 of this year, I received a very inspirational message from one of the families who lost their loved ones during the massacre of 1988. And they sent a special message to Professor Rehman to thank him, to tell him that how important this report is, just to see a valid and legal document in place to talk about that massacre of political prisoners in Iran and crime against humanity. We really appreciate that. And thank you very much for being here with us, everybody, and sharing your morning hours with us. And this event was organized by Women Freedom Forum and Women NC. Both organizations are NGOs who have consultative status with ECOSOC. Also, I would like to thank the sponsorship of Iranian Women Congressional Caucus and Iran Human Rights and Democracy Caucus for sponsoring and supporting our event. As Dr. Rehman mentioned well, now we have the document in our hand, and it is our duty to start the work and to take it to whenever it is necessary to our government, to our congressmen and women, to our senators, to the presidents, to all the everywhere that we could, including United Nations bodies, to ask them to create an investigation committee, to do more investigation, and to make Iranian regime accountable. This is not just about Iran. I think if we achieve this role, we are going to prevent this crime, similar crime against humanity at the global level. So this is our duty to take the next step. And thank you very much for spending your morning hours with us. Thank you.